Okay, so let's get started. So hello everyone and welcome. Today we're going to be covering Flexbox and CSS Grid. We're going to use CodePen for a lot of our demos, so if you guys want to go ahead and open up a blank CodePen right now while I kind of just talk about myself for a little bit, that'd be pretty great. So moving on. Who am I? I'm going to be Fleener. I work at Worldwide Technology. I'm a user experience designer. Also researcher, and also a user interface developer. So my background is in design, and I'm self-taught in research and development, which means that I've been lucky enough to skip past all of having to use tables, floats, and just all of those, hacky items to lay out contents on a web page. And good riddance, because CSS has outdone themselves with Flexbox and Grid. They're both relatively easy to use and quick to pick up. So like Mike said in our competition, we had to use CSS Grid. I had never used it before. The start of that, I think it was a conference day, I started watching tutorial videos, and then later that night I started implementing it with the help of Complete Guide to Grid by CSS Tricks. So when we start getting into the properties of each of these, I'll be switching back and forth to CSS Tricks and CodePen so we can kind of play around how it's working. CSS Tricks has done an incredible job of documenting all of the properties for each of these, as well as creating really nice visualizations to portray how it's working. If you've messed with Flexbox and Grid before, you know that there are a lot of properties to cover, more so Grid than Flexbox, but we'll kind of get into that later. So I always keep these up in my tabs for reference while I'm working until I kind of get in a flow of what I use the most, what's appropriate. And then, what is Flexbox? So how many people here have used Flexbox before? Okay, cool. So for those of you who don't know too much about it, it's a set of CSS properties that are used to distribute space and align the children within their parent container. It is one-dimensional, meaning that you choose whether your flex direction is either in a column, so top to bottom, or a row, left to right. Overall, it's pretty well supported, as long as you use auto prefixer. If you need to support older browsers, throw that in and you're pretty well good to go. And to better understand Flexbox, we kind of need to look at the parent-child relationship. So keep in mind that there are specific properties for the Flex parent and specific properties for the Flex children. So we're going to get started by switching over to CodePen and setting up our container and adding items within it. Let's see. Oops. Here is Flexbox. Before I get into the terminology, we'll start by naming our pen. I'm just going to do Flexbox Workshop. Boom. Done. And then we're going to start by creating the parent, and in this case we're just going to use section for this. So we'll start and end our section. And then we're going to add some children within it. So let's add a div with a class, of just item, singular, and then we'll give it a number, and then close that. And then we're going to copy this 3 other times, so we have 4. And then rename these, so 1, 2, 3, and 4. So right now, on the right-hand side, we can see our numbers there, but what's really going on behind the scenes? we are going to style some stuff up so we can see what we're working with. So we'll start with section, and let me switch over here. Okay, we're going to give it a border of 3 pixels. I'm going to make it solid, and you can use whatever color you want, but I'm going to keep within my color scheme. So and then we're going to give it a height of 50 viewport height, just so we can see kind of what's going on. And then a width of 80%. And let's just center it on the page, so margin 0 auto. Okay. So section is our parent, and to see our children and how they align with the parent on the inside, we're going to style these a little bit too.
Can you make that any bigger?
Yeah. Well, let's see. Oops, too big. Does that work?
That works, thank you.
Perfect. Okay. So we're going to give our item a background color. And again, you can use whatever colors you want. Okay. And then we'll give this a border as well. 3 pixels, solid, and then again, whatever color. The font size is a bit tiny, so let's bump that up to, let's say, 40 pixels. And then give this a margin of 5 pixels. And it looks like I need to save. It's my okay, there we go. Okay, so now we have our base set up with our parent. We can see the parent container here, and each child and how they're filling up this container. So we're going to go to our guide to Flexbox. This might be easier. Try and bump that up. And also let me know if this is too small too. So what I like about the guide to Flexbox is there is a lot of imagery that kind of helps you understand how things are working. So in this diagram, we have the main size, which is our parent Flex container, and then we have our Flex item children within it. So you see how it's kind of filling that in. And then an important thing to note here is these cross-axis and main axis. So the main axis is kind of how you align things in more of a row. And then the cross-axis is in terms of a column. And you can see that there's a cross start. So on the cross-axis, if we were using a Flex property like Flex start, it would begin at the top and the end would be at the bottom. And then centered and anything in between here. Same with the main axis. We have the main start here, and then over to the end. And we'll kind of get into which properties go with these. And then it has a long explanation for each. And then it's also separated into properties for the parent and properties for the children. We'll start with the parent, and then we'll end on the children. So display. On the parent, we want to add a display flex. And let's do that now. Let's go into section, and we will add display flex. And you'll notice that it went from a column into a row. Now the next property is flex direction. So we watched it go from a column to a row, and now we can define which exact one we want to use because the default is currently set at row. And there's actually more than just row and column. There's also row reverse and column reverse, and we'll kind of play around with that. So let's do flex direction on the parent. And then, as you can see, since it's a default, it's a row. And then we can add a column here, and it should stack. Boom. If we want to reverse the order, we do column reverse. So you'll notice that it reverses, instead of being aligned flex start, it's actually reversed to flex end, and then also in reverse order. Same goes for row reverse. Okay. So let's bring it back to just a row. And then we'll talk about flex wrapping. So in this case, we've got a row. I think this is where we are. Gonna want to add a width. Let's do 10%. And then let's add a height of 60 pixels. Okay. So you don't really have anything to wrap here. So let's go ahead and make this bigger. Say 50. Okay. So we see that it is evenly distributed within the parent, but there's no wrapping going on. We'll need to call that out with flex wrap. The default here is no wrap. So no wrapping. And then wrap. Let's make it a little bit smaller so you can see what's going on. Okay. And then, let's say, you can kind of see how it's working here. And if it grows bigger, it kind of wraps down, which is pretty nice, especially when you're creating fluid websites, fluid responsive websites. And stacking is crucial. Okay, so we have the height, we have that. There's also wrap reverse. And, of course, reverse order. So we'll keep, let's go no wrap. And then move on to the next one, which is flex flow. Now flex flow is just a shorthand. So instead of doing flex direction and flex row, we can do flex flow. And that way we can write row, which is the direction, and then whether you want to wrap or not, and I don't want to, so no wrap. And it's just a shortcut. Now, justify content, we kind of talked about the main axis and the cross axis, and justify content aligns more with the row of aligning the children along the main axis. So within the parent, still, we're going to do justify content. And then the default for this is flex start. So it will begin over here. And let's see, I'm going to adjust this a bit. Let's go to, yeah, okay. So I changed the width on the child children to be 10% so we can see how the alignment's working. Maybe that needs to be bigger. Okay. So we have flex starts at the beginning. Flex end will go to the right side. There you go. There's center, which will center everything. And then we have space between. This kicks the first and the last children to the very ends and then kind of aligns everything evenly in the middle. And then we have space around. And that adds spacing to the left and right per child, which is why there's only a half spacing alignment on the 1 and 4 on the left and right. And then space evenly spaces an even amount around all of the children. Looks very nice. Okay. Now, align items can always get kind of confusing with align content, which we'll get to in a second. But basically, we're just kind of aligning just the children on a span versus as like a content whole. So let's play around with this. There's align items, and then flex start. And you'll notice this kind of aligns more along that cross axes and not the main axes, which is the difference between justify and align. So we have flex start, default. Let's go to end. Should shoot it down to the bottom. Center will align all the items that way. And then with stretch, you notice that nothing happened with stretch. It's because we have a height set, and so it's overriding the stretch. So when we take the height off of our child, it will automatically stretch the children. I'm going to add the height back in because you don't really need this. And then the next one is baseline. So let's say we have a new class on number 3, and we'll call it item -3. And let's style this. We'll make it just a smidge bigger than the rest of them, or actually a lot bigger. Let's see, we want height. No, we want font size. The rest are 40, so let's go crazy and go 100. And then,
You have to put it after, right? It's cascading style, so you need to
Oh.
put it under the other one.
thank you. There we go. As you can see, it's out of its container, but everything is aligning to the baseline. So they're all aligned. So you don't want to keep this. Let's just keep it at center for now. And then I'm going to go ahead and take off, oops, the item 3. Okay. Align content. This time we're going to turn on wrap, and we're going to adjust the widths a little bit so we can see this better. Let's go 30. This is quite a bit. Okay. So we want, not items, we want content this time. And you can see it is justified on the main axis. We have center for the cross axis, and then space evenly here in a wrap. So flex start, default, aligns up top, flex end, bottom, center, we did this. Let's do space between. So top and bottom. And then space around and evenly. So similar stuff, just depending whether it's, a row or a column. Now for the fun stuff with the children. We are going to, I'm just going to center both the align content and the justify content. And there's an order property. So essentially, we have item 3 called out right now, and everything's in order from 1, 2, 3, 4. But if we want something to be out of order, we can apply this order property. What was it? Item 3. Let's say we want it, let's just do 2 for now. So it starts at 0. So this should align. Let's see, item, order 1. Okay. I'll make this easier to see too. Okay. So we have order 2, meaning that we want it to be after everything that has an order of 1. In this case, you'll notice that 1, 2, and 4, and then our other class, item 3, has been booted to the back, which we can also boot it to the front this way, which is an interesting way of ordering things. And then there is flex grow and flex shrink, and also flex basis that we can get into. Flex. So flex grow should tell this child to grow bigger than the rest of them when it is responding to different screen sizes. I'm going to say 2. And then let's do so flex grow on 1, 2, and 4 children. I have it growing once, and adding 2 makes it grow twice the size as the other ones. Let's see. You can kind of see how it responds that way, and let's give this a pixel value. Okay, so you see how it's kind of distributed with the just straight up pixel value. It keeps it at that size, whereas before we had a percentage, so it was taking up a percentage of the parent, and now we have a pixel size, so it should be pretty set, except for the child we asked to grow. It does its thing to fill the space. And then flex shrink. I don't use this one entirely a lot, so we're just going to mess with it a little bit. Let's give this a 1. Let's make our width of the parent, we have it at 80% right now. let's bring it to maybe 50, no, maybe 100. Well, in any way, it's supposed to give the ability for the flex item to shrink if necessary. And then flex basis defines the default size of an element before the remaining space is distributed. I don't use this one entirely a lot either, so I would just suggest playing around with it in your own time. And then the other one, align self, we want, there are different ones. There's auto, flex start, flex end, center, baseline, and stretch for the flex end. And this allows one child to kind of flex wherever. So let's see if we have everything set up. I'm going to bring this back to 80%. And we want item 3 to align self to flex end. And it should shoot it out to the bottom. Item 3. Let's change align content to align items. There. Okay. So you can kind of see how that's going. So overall, Flexbox is really great for kind of aligning items and distributing space along it. And it's super simple, as you can see. I guess we'll go into grid now, and then later we can kind of take pieces of this method conference site and try to flex or grid it. So going into grid, bear with me. Okay, so what exactly is CSS Grid? It's a two-dimensional layout, meaning that you can control your grid both left to right, right to left, top to bottom, and bottom to top. And you can sort of mix and match where things go and how the items in your grid will be laid out, which is pretty cool. But unlike Flexbox, it isn't widely supported across all browsers. So from CSS Tricks, as of March 2017, most browsers shipped native unprefixed support for CSS Grid. Chrome, Firefox, Safari, and Opera. Internet Explorer 10 and 11, on the other hand, support it, but on an older implementation with an outdated syntax. So I don't know how many of you have clients that use a lot of Internet Explorer 11. I know a lot of my clients do, and there is a way to use CSS Grid in IE 11 using the old implementation of Grid. And I was going to share a mix-in with you guys to kind of help with this. But the developer who made it couldn't get clearance from the client he billed for with it, so I can't really show it to you. But it is possible, and I'm sure you can find some other people who have come up with this solution on the internet somewhere. So just do a deep dive, but don't hesitate to try to use Grid, even if your clients are using IE11. It's possible. You just need to do a little bit more work to get it to working. And it's also good to learn Grid now, even though it's not widely supported, because once you'll kind of be ahead of the game learning it now. So when it does become supported, you already have the knowledge. You can just get right into it, and basically your employer doesn't have to, give you time to spin up on it. You'll be ready to kick things off. So similar to Flexbox, there are properties specific to the Grid parent container and Grid children items. So again, no, I am a designer. I'm not utilizing these tools every day. So you'll see how expansive the properties are in a second, which is why it's always a good idea to keep the CSS tricks guide open as a reference. It'll take a lot of repetition to kind of familiarize yourself more, and having all of these properties more ingrained with you the more you use it. So practicing now is always really good. Again, the properties aren't difficult to grasp. There's just a lot of them. And like math, there's so many different solutions that you can create out of what they have to offer, which is pretty nice. Going back in history of, how I was talking about the hacky stuff you had to do for layout, it's difficult as a designer to design something based off of a Grid layout where the developers are trying to have to hack their way to get everything so precise when it's super difficult. And this tool helps bridge those gaps and is going to help us create really complex, really cool layouts super quickly, and probably have a lot of less code with that, which is nice. So we're going to move over to CSS tricks and CodePen and play around with these concepts a little bit more. I just want to let you guys know I'm along for the ride with this, because last time I touched Grid was during that conference hackathon type thing we did. And if you guys want to chime in, if something's not working and you know what's going on, let me know. Let's back out of that though. So Grid, I'll give you a little overview of all of the properties. And this is a very long web page, bear with me. So there's terminology relating to the Grid container, which would be the parent to the Grid items. And the Grid items are the children. So each of these divs is a child to this container. Grid lines, you can actually call out grid lines if you want to. So basically they separate the grid cells, which we'll get to in just a second. And another cool thing about Gridline is if you use Firefox, they have really great developer tools where you can see all of your grid lines and how things are working, and it's super neat. So check that out. And then grid tracks. Grid tracks are your columns or rows. And then you have your grid cell, which would be one child. And then a grid area, which is like a clump of them. And here is the table of contents, so a shortened version. And then as we go, we'll see, again, on the right are the children, the properties for the children, and the left are the properties for the parent. And there's a lot of stuff. We can start out talking a little bit about grid template columns and grid template rows. You actually get to call out how many children are within a column and how many children are within a row, which is really nice. And then here is the call out for the grid lines. You can name them. First, line 2, line 3. And then we can also align them. So grid column start. Grid template areas is pretty neat. So what this does is you can name your children. And what I did in this competition was I had my breakpoints, and I knew that a certain area of the grid was going to move down to mobile, so I set it up with 2 grid areas. One, I think I labeled it top and one bottom for how they were going to align. And basically you name it, and the way that you write it is how it's going to show up in the grid. So if you do have a responsive website and you make a breakpoint, you can rearrange them however you want, which is pretty cool. It is also difficult with hierarchy if you think about it, but I'm sure there are other ways that this is super useful and not jarring. So in this case, they're using a header, a main, a sidebar, and a footer right here, and these are the grid areas. And you can mix and match. So let's say on desktop you want main here, and then on tablet you want main all the way over here. That's easy with just typing it into the grid area. And then grid template. And grid template areas. Okay. Header, header, footer, footer, footer. This defines these would all be related to the header, and each of these would be the children. And again, this would be the children within that. There's grid column gap, grid row gap. Let me switch this over to kind of get a base set up, and you guys can start playing with grid a little bit. We're going to start the same in CodePen of doing our base divs. In this case, I'm going to do a div with a class name of container. And then we're going to end it, and then we're going to create the grid children. Div, class, items. Let's also label these items -1 as a secondary class, and then give it a number. You know what? I'm going to copy and paste this. Got 4 here. Let's do 5. Okay, now let's style our container. We're going to give it a border of 3 pixels, solid. Oops. And then a color. And then a margin of 100 pixels and auto. And then let's style our children. We'll give them a background color. Did I do items? Oh man. Well, these need to be singular, so apologies if you also made them plural. Border again of 3 pixels, solid, and a color. Font size of 40 so we could see it. And in this case, one thing that is nice is that you don't have to pick whether you want to use Flexbox or Grid. You can use them both in tandem. So Flexbox has really great alignment tools like we looked at, which could just be an extra line of code in Grid. But just because we're going to play to strengths, let's align the contents within here with a display flex. And then we're going to justify content center and align item center. Okay. Flex. It's not kicking off into a row. Okay. Flex direction. I guess we'll do this. And now we get a debug. So we've defined the children to each have a display of flex. So the items within it, the numbers, you know what? It's because it's the numbers. We don't have extra numbers, so that's why. And we are not aligning this because we haven't added a grid yet. So, okay. On the container, we're going to see what grid does. So we're going to go on display grid and just see how it interacts. Now with Flexbox, we saw it either go to a row or a column. With Grid, it didn't really do anything. And that's because we have to define the, we're going to define a width of 500. We are going to add some columns. Let's give it a grid template columns. And just for now, we're going to do percentages, but you can do pixels, you can do auto, and you can do fractions. So we just need to make sure that it gets to, for percentages, we want it to add up to 100%. So we can define each column to be whatever we need it to be. So the first column is going to be 10%. We're going to make the second column 40%. And the next two, we'll make those 20% and then 10%. And now you can see on this row, because we haven't defined any rows yet, so it's all in one row and there's 5 columns, that they're all various different widths. And these should respond. Responding, we can do a min width. So I have a min width of 50 pixels, and you can kind of see how this responds. And then let's add, I'll show you the pixels. So go pixel-wise and take the min width off, just have a regular width. We have defined 100 pixel. We have auto, and that will auto size, while the others stay at 100 pixels. 100, 100. Oh, did I do too many? No. We need to keep them in width. As you can see, the auto number 2 is the only one responding, filling up the container as it grows or shrinks. And then we can define a row by using grid template rows. We'll give it 3 100 pixel and we can't see them because we would have to add some more boxes. Or let's take a few of these off and they should wrap down. Okay. We can kind of keep going and playing around with anything, but does anybody have any questions for me? Or do we just want to keep playing and seeing how this is working? Oops, sorry.
Got a question.
Mm-hmm.
Would this take the place of a responsive framework?
Ooh, responsive framework. Can you give me an example?
So could I replace a page written in Twitter Bootstrap with Flexboxes and Grids?
Yes. You don't need Bootstrap. Say bye to Bootstrap. Build your own layout.
Do you find yourself using this as a designer to mock things or explain designs or?
Yes. So with the client who is using the IE version of this, the design was built off of 12 grid column. Let's see if I can, I don't think I have an example to show you, but it was a 12 grid column with gaps, and that's used cross-site. So every component would align within the grid, and the grid was laid out with a mix-in, so that technically any component that you make, wherever you put it on the page, will look cohesive within that grid. And it's a better way of thinking about designs because there's so many possibilities of things you can do. It adds a cohesion factor to things. Let me think. There's got to be a better way I can explain this. But yes, overall, it's a good thing for designers to know how to use because it's easier on the devs that you are aligned on a specific system of how you're creating your components and putting them in. Because I've seen some crazy designs that do not fit within the system, and it's like, okay, I'm going to have to figure out a different way to put the code together to get this to work. But if the designer had been on the same page and known more about grid and how it actually functions, it would have been a better experience. So for me, personally, why I'm more of a mixed bag of design and development is that I like bridging the gap of the conversation. So when I design things knowing like, okay, this is going to stack, or we can only use Flexbox for this, and I know how Flexbox works, so I know how to design and make all the decisions based off of that won't kill a budget or kill a time frame. And knowing grid too can help if you're doing a more complex design that you need structure to. And being able to talk with the devs about, hey, I'm thinking, like let's say we're going to use the grid areas. They might not know a whole lot about that. So me having the conversation of, hey, I know this cool thing in grid that just got supported on whatever, and I want to use this. Is this cool with you guys? This is what I was thinking, so we're all on the same page, and it makes processes go a little bit smoother. This is probably a really long-winded answer, but I nerd out about being able to talk with the devs in an efficient way and to give my clients the best experience with the cleanest code and that users just functionally like, which is difficult sometimes. Anyone else? Okay, well, what I'm going to do is show you, just for funsies, we're going to remake the footer in the method conference using Flexbox. I want a code pen though. So I'm going to make a brand new one. And it seemed like half the room has used Flexbox before, but just to have you guys tap into my brain and how I work, when I see a website like this, I always like to map out how the grid system works or the Flex system works. So for me, the easiest one where I was like, oh, that'd be a simple Flex would be the footer, because of the space between property of having two divs and one parent, so two children with their content each in there, and then all you have to do is just do a flex, and then space between, and everything is there and done, super quick. So to expand on this, we're going to start with our HTML. We want a parent container, which will be the full footer, so I'm just going to name this footer. And then in that, I know we have 2 buckets of content. We have this copyright with, We Heart Springfield. And I don't want to pull these icons, so I'm just going to have this go to the right instead of staying within this bucket. So I want the copyright line, which I'm just going to copy because I can. And we are going to add a div with a class. Have any of you guys used BIM before? Naming class systems? Okay, I'll show you a little BIM too. This is going to be a 2-column. This is specific, and then this will be the right-hand side, just so we can distinguish between the two. Div. And then in that, I'm going to put the copyright. I don't quite remember what the code is for the actual copyright icon, so we're just going to roll with this. And then I'm going to create the div class 2-column left. Oops. Now I'm going to steal this flag image. New tab. Okay. And I'm going to add an image here. Image source. source equals, there's our flag. Let's close it. It's massive. So let's add let's go height of auto so it doesn't get funky, and then a width of 50 pixels. See how big that is. That's good enough. And then I'm going to steal this copy. And paste that. We want that with the flag. Put it in a P tag. Kill all this extra space. Okay, so now we have that. We have two children within the parent. So now let's define the flex. So we have footer. We'll do a display flex on this. I always like to add a background color to help me visualize this stuff. Okay. So it's already in a row, that's what we wanted. But our content in 2-column left is still stacked. So this is where we're going to nest some more flex. We're going to style the 2-column left. There we go. And we're going to give this a display of flex. Should turn it into a row. Need some padding. Padding left. Say like 5 pixels. That's not enough. Let's go 15. That'll do. So those are aligned in a row. We've got both the children aligned, but now we want to shoot the copyright to the right. So we don't want it to wrap either, so we'll do our flex flow, our shorthand property. Give it a direction of row, and then do no wrap because I don't want it to wrap. Okay. And then we want to do justify, because this goes along the main axis, so the row axis, and we want that to have a space between. Okay. We also want some, yes. We don't want to do space around because or do we? Let's try it out, actually. Now I'm curious. No, it's in too far. So we're going to define a padding within the parent. Give it like 10 pixels. Might be too much. That's fine. And then we see that the copyright isn't aligned centered here. So that's where we do align items center. Okay. And that's the footer. Super simple, not a whole lot. Okay. let's see. Technically, we can do a flex here to get these two. We can also do a grid. And then looking at this, we could have a 2-column grid. And then within this, the content, I would likely just display flex on these and flex align these to fit within that box. And that's kind of the whole nested flex box within grid. And there aren't really predefined things on whether or not nesting Flexbox inside of grid is good or bad. It's kind of just whatever you find is the best solution for what you're doing. And what's easiest. Anyone have any questions? I know this is really short. I wasn't imagining to blow by a lot of this content as quickly as I did. Ooh, there's a new thing coming out called subgrid. Yeah. So you have a grid. You have a grid system laid out, and then whenever you have components, you don't want to give the components a different grid. You want it to fit within your grid ecosystem you've already built. And subgrid is coming out in the next level of grid. So we have level 1 out right now, and then level 2, I believe, is going to have subgrid within it. So you create your component, and it automatically just fits within the grid system that you've already created, which is pretty cool. I wonder if you can. We can play with it, see what goes on. I haven't really done that or tried that since grid came out. Let's see, we have grid here. Grid item. Let's say we have a div class. Let's do sub item. Okay, it's a grid. 1. Ooh. Item 1, let's do. Okay. Grid. Columns. We have 3. Let's do. Actually. Okay. I mean, technically, yeah, you can have an inception of grids if you want to.
Have you ever found that YouTube?
Not me personally.
Yeah, I'm thinking that way, maybe should rethink your design.
Yeah, it kind of all depends. I'd honestly have to think of a design where I would want to use a grid within a grid. It just makes more sense to me to have Flexbox. I guess the only other thing could probably be like having something similar to this. So let's say you already have a grid system set in place here, but you want to have multiple, well, another grid inside of it to help align some of this content and break it up. That would make sense to me. And then drilling down deeper, that seems like maybe more of a component-based grid within a grid within a grid. Did you have a question?
Yeah, so kind of something like that, can you do something with grid like you can with tables, say call span, multiple columns, or row span? Is there something like that in grid?
Yes. Oh boy, so this has been quite a while for me, and I honestly should finish up this. I'll skip to the end. So a good way to kind of visualize that, I was playing around with Grid Garden, and it kind of helps with spanning through different items within that grid row and column. So I recommend, like, if you like learning how to code with code-based games, they're pretty fun. Flexbox Froggy is what I learned Flexbox with. And that was super easy. Grid Garden, I think I broke it once because I couldn't figure something out and I forced it. So I refreshed and then it started working again. But it is a really good way to play around of seeing how you can span certain items. And there's so many different terminology that it's mind-boggling. Which is kind of why I didn't go too in-depth with that. There's just so much content. Like I was finding it difficult to be able to do a whole demonstration and keep that retained in my brain. But understanding the base concepts for grid, I would start with Grid Garden and then move on to the other stuff. And then Wes Boss, he has a podcast called Syntax that he does with this guy named Scott Tolinsky. Yeah, and they call them tasty treats for web developers, and that's a fun listen. And then Firefox sponsored Wes Boss to create a free, I think it's a 25 video course on CSS Grid, and he goes really in depth with it. And that is cssgrid.io. And then his personal website is wesboss.com. So I recommend those if you want to kind of deep dive into it. And then Rachel Andrews, she's a really great, or Andrew, is a really great speaker on CSS and CSS Grid and Flexbox. She talks a lot about some of the new things that are going to go on with it, and she does a lot of philosophical talks on that. So I recommend watching her talks. They're on YouTube. She also has a website of strictly grid stuff, Grid by Example, and then her personal one, she's a chief editor or writer for Smashing Magazine, so she's got a ton of articles out there on that. And the main hub is just her website. So resources on trying to learn more about this stuff, I would recommend these. There's also a lot out there to learn from, and a lot of workshops online that are free that you can tap into. That was also a long-winded answer, but yes, you can span. And it's easier to do than in, in tables. I'm forgetting tables. The last time I did a table was whenever I was hard coding emails. I don't know if anybody's had to do that, but it's a nightmare. Never say yes to that. That's a horrible experience. And that was my introduction to coding, so I don't, I don't know how I got here. But yes.
You always, I was gonna ask, but do you happen to know the resources you mentioned about using grid and Explorer 11 or Flexbox? Do you know where those resources were?
Mine is a personal resource, but I can't share it. But, what?
Can I use this document?
Yeah, yes. Kind of use this will tell you the browser support. If you want to find out the hacks on how to use Grid in IE11, simple Google search, and you can try it out, see if it does work or not. I'm sure browser Stack Overflow, that's right. Somebody's got to have a solution on there too. And then,
I was just gonna ask about like hero codes and Flexbox. Do you have any examples of that?
hero codes?
Yeah.
What do you mean by that?
Like it doesn't fit between the containers like you want it to, so you move it in one page. Seem great. I don't know. I just remember learning about it in basic on the W3 schools.
Mhm.
Yeah, and they have like hero code things. I was wondering, like, can you use those in CodePen and Flexbox?
I'm not quite sure what it is, but do any of these ring a bell? And this was in W3?
Yeah, I was, sorry, my class was taught by the stats teacher, so we just kind of walked through W3 schools, and I just remember there being something called like a hero code or something, like if you needed to put like an image in between different things and it didn't fit in the box.
Oh, not like a background image, right? Something
I
different?
An element,
An element?
I don't know.
Beats me.
Yeah.
They're calling it hero image in W3 schools.
Oh, hero image.
Crazy.
And we're talking like hero image as in this.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, that would be, I would say that would be a background image. And then on top of that, so the parent would have the background image. And then you can get it to fill either from the width or the height. And you would set that. And then inside that parent, your children or child would likely be this. And it would be an image or an SVG, if that's what that is. And then some text. Oops. And then I believe how this is working is there's a height, and it is justified content center. And then all of these are line centered. And then probably a margin, no, padding on top.
Okay, thank you.
Yep, okay.
Are there any deciding factors on when to use a Flexbox versus a grid? So certain flags going forward to go, should I use this or that?
CSS Tricks kind of talks about it as like grid is mainly for layout. So a big website layout, And then thinking in terms of Flexbox as being more component-based as to a full-on website. 'Cause, I mean, you probably could use Flex for a website, but it's going to be a bunch of Flexbox components filling it. So, but no definitive reason why you can't use either. It's right now. It's just kind of up to you. Did you have a?
Yeah, so like when you're starting on like a new project, what's like your process when you're like doing a new website?
So let's say I'm just given a layout and I really don't know anything about it. I'm going to make some assumptions that you get a desktop layout and then you would get either a tablet or a mobile layout. And in that, because I'm very visual, I like to sketch it out. And it helps with the breakpoints and where I know where to add my containers or divs. So for me, I'll sketch out the grid of what it is, and I'll add the contents in. And then the way I look at it is kind of from a Flexbox perspective of how is this contained within something. So like easy thing would be a header or like a navigation. There's going to be likely a hamburger menu here on mobile. This is not an easy explanation. There would probably be a bunch of links in the right or left-hand side, and then I would kind of just think to myself how they're aligned with a Flexbox property to know how to contain those into one thing. And then I would just go down the line, and if something's a body that fits together, I know that I can contain those in one thing and then flex align those to fit within the design. And a lot of that helps when you're just drawing boxes, wireframing, and then you can figure out all the other stuff later and inject it in.
What's the most difficult design challenge you've tackled? One of them.
That's a good question. The last company I worked for was an advertising agency, and they did a lot of responsive websites, and a lot of them were landing pages for products, so I wouldn't say any one of those was overly complicated. But Jeff, we did Smuckers, and there was grid involved in Smuckers when we had some articles that we had at the bottom of the web page, and that one was really tricky. We had to do a lot of calculations, and I believe the client was using Internet Explorer 2, so we had to include some fallbacks on that. And my coworker Brian, he kind of took the lead on. I think he used a bit of grid and a bit of Flexbox to tackle that piece, but he got it working really nicely. It was difficult, but it looked great in the end. So it's not to say that a grid and Flexbox are going to be super simple in everything that you do. There are going to be some times where it can be a little complex and you have to add a lot of math into it. And then anything I've worked on recently I've just been mostly in the design side and research side, so I haven't had to deal with that a whole lot. Yeah, no, I can't think of anything off the top of my head.
You're talking about Smuckers.com, like the jelly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was looking at it now, and yeah, it seems like it was difficult to pull off.
Well, I think the one I'm talking about is a food service, like B2B website.
Oh, gotcha.
Which is an interesting concept in itself of, we all know the big brands like Smuckers, but they also have B2B side, which is a different, usually a different website and different products.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I remember during that competition, you had to do like an animation and like box that flip? Like, how did you accomplish that?
Google. Like most things, you know? I mean, to be real, unless you get the experience, you are going to be Googling a lot of stuff. Unless somebody, like most of my coworkers would teach me things. If I had questions, I would just ask them and they would teach me. But other than that, if I didn't want to bother them with so much stuff, I would Google, like that day. That was a lot of Google.
Do you know any websites that are really exemplary of crazy designer-like things that you have done with Flexbox or CSS Grid that look noticeably different than a regular old bootstrap website?
I'd really have to deep dive into that. I feel like most awards websites, though, have a lot of complexity, and I would assume a lot of those have to use Grid, but I haven't really kind of dived into their code to know. But that's a good question, and now I want to find them.
I was going to say on Mother's Brewing website, I know their beer bottles like bounce up when you give it.
Oh.
And then like the bottles like bounce.
Um,
And it's like not responding properly, it's just to like bounce the entire bottle up and yeah, it's been a minute since Mostly Serious designed it. So like if they added the bottle, it's wrong, see, but the littler ones, those are the ones that Mostly Serious added. Because I talked with Miranda about it. Like that one, the next one over.
oh my gosh,
The
it's
skinny,
auto-scrolling me.
little one. Like
This
that
one?
Yeah. So it's supposed to show like most of it, but I'm thinking they
Oh.
ruined the border, yeah. It used to be better than this.
Well, yeah, when they uploaded, I'm assuming that they have a CMS within this, so then they can add more content. And they might not have sized the image correctly when they entered it in, because this one looks way bigger than this one, which would make sense why it's getting cut off.
Yeah, I think they added like newer flavors and then they had to add the bottle in. So it can use help again.
Yeah. That's also something to plan for too, especially when you're dealing with CMS and you know that maybe a designer isn't going to be uploading content. You kind of have to have that in mind of what are all the worst case scenarios of what could happen and how can I code this to ensure that that doesn't happen. So yeah, this might just need to be a tweak that they didn't get to, but who knows.
So for making a grid for the whole thing, is it pretty much just breakpoints or is there some?
Good question. I want to say that you would need to still have breakpoints, but I would say you would, because then you can define how many columns are hitting in mobile. So instead of thinking of how something's wrapping down or stacking, you would literally just hard code how it would stack versus expecting it to do the thing that you want it to do. And the good news too is that it is pretty well supported on mobile.
Because my experience with it has been the UX team, the design team, just the designs. And it seems like we're at the
I'm pretty sure Envision should have a tool, like a developer tool, where you can export code out of it. I don't quite remember how good it was since the last time I used it, but I am on board with Figma right now. It's really nice. And the cool thing is, one of the cool things is if you have a predefined design system, the way you label your system, the devs can see on their end. So if they're creating the components or the CSS for it, actually I think we were using tokens for that. So they would pull the tokens, and then all they would have to do is reference the name that was in the file, and all of that code has gotten pulled in, which is really nice. But you can also, I believe, take SVGs out of there, and our devs, they just pull all the content out. I usually never have to have a conversation with them about what's going on. They can, pick it up super easy and then just run with it.
So what brought you to UX design?
Well, I did print for a while, and I hated it. So then I just found websites a lot cooler of a medium to play with because there's so much into it. Like, one thing that really intrigues me is how people use a product. And that even though there are common systems out there, depending on the demographic of people you're working with, the clients that I worked with were usually like maybe 40 plus. And so things of common patterns that I was using on like social media, they weren't picking up because they're not used to that. And so at first, when I was designing, I would get a little bit annoyed by it because I'm like, how do you not know this? This is easy. But after getting more experience in the field and understanding why, it makes complete sense why they wouldn't, because they're not in tune with it. And so I was just always intrigued by how people used websites, how far it's come, what the new things, like CSS Grid and animations, all of those things that are starting to come out now, it's just super cool to me, and I just somehow nerd out about it. And I got the opportunity at Marlin Network to do both print and web design. And then I kind of just told them, hey, I want to do web more. And I shadowed one of the UX designers there for a while. And then I decided, oh, I like being able to build the thing that I've designed. And then that brought a whole new light to me of like how I design, because I was designing very poorly for web, and I had no idea until I started building stuff. So that's kind of like a snowball effect of what it's done to my life, and I dig it. I really love digital products, and mobile and web apps are fun now too. I don't think there was any like super inspirational moment though, especially since my first turn with digital stuff was emails. Because I was working with a designer developer, and he did not want to do them anymore. And I told him, hey, I want to learn how to code. He's like, cool, you want to do my emails? I'm like, yes! And so I started doing it, and I'm like, this is so cool, you know? I'm just weird, so that's all I can say. Probably not, a general population way of getting into UX, but it is a way. That's honestly all I have. So we can cut this short, but we can also take more questions.
Where do you track changes to CSS? Is there a blog that you're following or something? Or is those the ones that you covered are the ones that will tell, like, here's updates that are in CSS?
A lot of it I hear from, a lot of my coworkers, because sometimes, especially with the client I'm working on now, I'm too head down in client work to kind of branch out. Some resources I was using before, and I don't know if it still exists. It's Use Panda. And basically you can subscribe to a bunch of different feeds. I used a lot of, or I subscribed to a lot of web design layout, blogs or websites, and it basically compiles them all in here. But you can also subscribe to different news channels and article channels, which might help feed in new content that's coming out of like, hey, here's an update. On CSS Grid, this is coming out and at whatever date being released to use. I'd probably find that in my feed here. I haven't used it in quite a while, but that is a good start to compile resources and find ones that you haven't heard of. And then, I don't know if you're a podcaster or anything, but that's always a good way because they'll conversationally just talk about, hey, this new thing is coming up. And lots of those guys do work with people who are creating them. So you kind of get to hear a little bit more in-depth talks about it before, solid information is released. I don't have specific ones to give you. But I can get them if you're interested, and then always send them later. Mm-hmm. Sure. Yeah. How many of you guys are part of the Springfield Dev Slack? Are you guys in the front-end design channel? If not, you should be. Yeah.
On the CodePen website, can you talk more about like the other things that are on there, like the learning section? Like there's like challenges and other people's pens that you can look at and that kind of stuff, like on the side.
I don't know much about the challenges, but I do know this is where a lot of people post snippets of things. And how I've used it is more of a place where I can experiment without actually having to build up a file and go through the whole process in the terminal of installing things. It's just a quick way to share some things that you're experimenting with, and you can find different snippets on here of what other people are working on that might be cool.
Can you actually like see the code that they
Yeah, that's the cool thing about it. And you can fork it too. I think I mentioned that in my bio, but we didn't fork it because I was like, no, let's just, we'll work through this together. But basically, you can take somebody else's CodePen and you can fork it to your own account, and then you can interact with their code, but it won't save to their account. It only saves to your account. So you can have it there and then just play with it. That's another good question.
Under the CSS grid.
Mm-hmm. This one? Oh. So.
In the UX field, what's the opinion on why versus CSS versus SCSS?
I don't, it's kind of, from what I've heard, it's just kind of, and you're saying CSS versus, I've always heard it's per preference. At least every project I've spun up on, the devs have always asked me, what do you want to use? And I'm always like, isn't there just a thing I use that's the best thing? And they go, no, some people like writing it this way and that way, so it's just per preference. I'm sure there are ups and downs to it, I just personally don't know.
Are there any upcoming design trends or patterns you're excited about?
Design trends or patterns? That I'm also not sure. I would say newer technologies, though, are kind of where I've been putting my time into, like AI. How do I design for that? Especially when you have a client who has heard of it, but they don't really quite know what they're actually wanting.
Sorry.
Mike, it's turned into more of like a Q&A, so we're not working on anything, just so you know.
All news is here, so.
Oh, cool. Great time.
Let's just go back to your pen and do it again.
All of it over again? Okay.
Just for the news.
Well, we should probably close this tab. This was new to me, though, is the inception of grids. I didn't really know that I could do that. Does anybody have any more questions? Anything?
Are there any design patterns that make you cringe?
Cringe? Probably a lot.
Yeah.
But, here's a source for you. Mobbin. Have you guys heard of this?
No.
It shows a compiled list of different patterns used in apps. So this might be a good way where you find more of the trends appearing here.
I'm really tired of seeing these patterns over and over again.
When they're not like usable by a user, like if it's a difficult thing, then it's like, stop. Just please, like, hire a researcher to tell you not to do that. Because you'd be surprised how many companies don't have a user experience researcher that, honestly, actually, let me take this back a second. There's a lot of companies that don't do user-centered design, and that kind of cringes me a little bit, because you should always be designing for the user, no matter how ugly it is, if it's functional. Okay, should be back. To go back to that topic, though, there might be patterns that I personally don't like, but they are patterns that work, and so why not use things that work and not stray away, because if you do stray, you might end up with something worse than that. And you could, lose your users in that process. So whatever works, and just roll with it. There are always smaller things that you can tweak to make you like it a little bit more, but.
Like, I know I went through several of the sponsor websites, and out of 10, maybe 6 of them look templated.
Oh.
And I know, like, our website was built from scratch by one of our owners, and it still kind of looks like 4 or 5 others because it's all the trendy layouts and all the trendy designs.
Mm-hmm.
So do you try to just go with the flow of what's working, or do you try to deviate from that?
I'm a deviator, but let me tell you, sometimes you can't deviate, especially per client and per budget and timeline. So if I had to guess about why they all look the same, it's because they're picking the things that work and they don't have a lot of budget or time to spend on that, so they're just kind of plopping it out there to get themselves out, which makes complete sense to me from a business standpoint. But yeah, the best thing to do is go with what works and then find things that you can tweak a little bit so it's not so obvious that you're ripping off something completely. You are taking it and making it your own. And a lot of that stuff does have to do with the brand too, because if you have a really strong brand, you can do the same stuff that everybody else is doing, but you just don't notice it.
Is there times you've fought with a client over a way to go on a certain design?
Oh yeah. Well,
How do you give that stuff up? And
you have to do it in more of you scream on the inside kind of thing, but you find ways to try to talk to them about it and try to find a happy medium. And sometimes your client just doesn't want to, and you kind of have to tell yourself, all right, this is what they want and this is what they're paying for. I offered 3 other different solutions that were better, but that's one that they want to go with. And when it performs bad, I've already covered my bases of letting them know. Here's what to watch out for if we do use this design. And if they still sell into it, they've asked for that. So you just have to do it in the best way and keep a professional attitude about it. But there will definitely be a ton of times where you're just like, no, listen to me, please. That's why you hired me. Well, if there aren't any more questions, you guys are free, and you're not held here till it's supposed to be 4:30. But I will still be around if you want to chit chat later.
Thank you for your time, Ruby.
Thank you guys for your time.